Fox 10 News and WSFA 12 News present the Alabama District 2 congressional debate between Democratic candidate Shamari Figures and Republican candidate Caroline Dobson. Live from the Mobile Chamber of Commerce in downtown Mobile, here's your moderators, Fox 10's Sarah Wall and Cameron Taylor. Sponsored by All In Credit Union and Southern Cancer Center.
Good evening. My name is Bradley Byrne. I'm the President and CEO of the Mobile Chamber of Commerce. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Chamber tonight. We're so pleased to have this partnership with Fox 10, a partnership that we greatly appreciate. We also appreciate these two candidates, Ms. Dobson and Mr. Figures. They've taken time out of a very busy campaign schedule to spend time with us tonight to answer questions on issues that are of concern to the voters of this area. So we appreciate them and their campaigns for being here. There are not too many close house races in America right now. This is one. So sit back, listen to their answers, and pick the right one. God bless America, and it's over to you two guys now.
All right, Mr. Byrne, thank you so much, and welcome to everyone joining us this evening. Good evening, and welcome to the Mobile Chamber of Commerce and the Alabama District 2 congressional debate. I'm Sarah Wall with Fox 10 News.
And I'm Cameron Taylor. Tonight, you're going to hear from both of these candidates vying for Alabama's newest congressional district.
And this debate is being hosted by Fox 10 and the Mobile Chamber of Commerce. In addition, it's also airing on our sister station, WSFA, in Montgomery.
Now, these two candidates right here, Democrat Shamari Figures and Republican Caroline Dobson. Now, let's go over the rules.
All right, so the first thing we need to talk about is the candidates will have 2 minutes for opening statements, and then we will get to the questions. Candidates will have 1 minute each to answer the question, followed by 30 seconds each for rebuttal.
Candidates will alternate answering questions first. They'll have 2 minutes each for closing statements.
And we did do a coin toss before we started, and Ms. Dobson won the coin toss, so you are going first.
Ms. Dobson, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Caroline Dobson, and I'm running to make life better for Alabama families. I grew up in the small town of Beatrice, Alabama in Monroe County. I'm the proud daughter of 2 rural health care providers, proud granddaughter of 2 public school teachers. I now live in Montgomery with my husband and 2 daughters, where I practice real estate law and serve on the Alabama Forestry Commission. Both of my girls were born in Alabama, and there's nowhere else I'd rather raise my family than here, where the values of faith, humility, and hard work are part of who we are. However, like many of you probably, I'm concerned about where our country is headed. I've never been in politics before. I'm just a working mom, also like some of you, but I want to make life better for Alabama families. I'm running to bring down gas and grocery prices. I'm running so that your kids can play in your neighborhoods without you wondering if they'll get home safely or not. I'm running against a Washington, D.C. insider, someone who spent his entire adult career in Washington, D.C. and owns a $1.5 million house there. What's more, he came to this district 2 days before the filing deadline to run for this seat. He's been part of an administration that's been hurting Alabama families with reckless government spending, leniency on crime, and open borders. And he wants to continue the policies of the last 4 years. He believes in more government. I believe in you. And you and I have to ask ourselves, are we better off now than we were 4 years ago? I've yet to find a person who answers that question yes. We don't need more Washington insiders funding Washington. What we need is Alabamians fighting for Alabama families. Join with me and let's fight to make life better for Alabama families. Vote Dobson on November 5th.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you now have 2 minutes.
Thank you. I want to thank Fox 10 here in Mobile and WSFA in Montgomery and the Chamber of Commerce here in Mobile for hosting this event yet again and giving us yet another opportunity to speak to voters. Look, I'm Shamari Figures, and this city that we're standing in right now here in Mobile, this is home for me. This is where I live. It's where I was born. It's down the street at Mobile Infirmary. It's where I was raised over in Tobinville. It's where I was educated at Mary B. Austin and Council Traditional School and Phillips Prep and John L. LaFleur High School. This is the district that is home to my family, going back literally up to Clark County, back to slavery. This is where we come from. This is who made me. This is who prepared me to go off and have the opportunities and the career that I had, that I've had to this point in my life. And that's been a career that has taken me across federal government, where I've had the privilege to work for President Obama in the White House. I've had the privilege to spend time working in the place that we're seeking to go back to represent in Congress as a staffer in the U.S. Senate. And I've had the opportunity to work at a federal agency. I have taken the opportunity that's been afforded to me just by virtue of growing up here and being informed here, to learn how federal government works, to learn how to navigate it. That's not to be confused with agreeing with how it works in every respect, because there are things that we can, should, and will work to change. But we know how to make it work for the people of this district. We know how to take it and navigate it and work through it and get to solutions. And we will not get to solutions by finger pointing and accusing the other side of being the end of the world while the other side accuses that side of being the end of times. We will only get there the same way that my parents did it, that my grandparents did it, that your parents and your grandparents did it. And that's by stepping down in that ditch, pulling up your pants legs, rolling up your sleeves and getting to work, setting aside partisan differences to work towards a common goal with a common end to bring solutions to the problems that we have here locally in this district. I look forward to sharing my vision with you tonight.
All right, Mr. Figures, thank you very much. As we mentioned, each candidate will have 1 minute to answer and then a 30-second rebuttal.
Okay, here's the first question. Mobile businesses, especially those involved in international trade, are affected by tariffs and trade policies. How would you approach U.S. trade relations, particularly with China and Europe, to ensure Alabama businesses can compete globally without facing punitive tariffs that increase costs for local manufacturers and exporters? Ms. Dobson, you have 1 minute.
Look, I'm running to make life better for Alabama families, and there is no doubt that the manufacturing industries in this district have been suffering over the last 4 years due to energy policy, due to increased inflation, and part of that is also ensuring that we have to have fair trade. Since 2001, Alabama has lost 42,000 manufacturing jobs. So we have to ensure that we have an even playing field for our manufacturers here in Alabama. We also have to acknowledge that we have companies here in Mobile within a few miles of where we're standing right now. Airbus, Austal, Evonik, that rely on components from foreign countries. So we have to ensure that what's good for this district is good for the families in this district and fight for fair trade.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you now have 1 minute.
Oh, this is one of those issues where we can specifically point to the previous administration. The last 4 years did not cause nearly as much harm as the Trump tariffs did to many businesses, especially in the manufacturing and industrial industries. Those tariffs hurt manufacturers. Those tariffs led to inflation. Those tariffs led to long lead times, right? So we want to be responsible in our trade policies. We want to make sure that American companies are prioritized, but we have to be realistic and understand that we are in a global economy where we rely on things that are manufactured and assembled in other countries as they rely on us. And so our policies have to reflect that understanding. And so we cannot penalize American businesses to satisfy egos of a particular president or a political party. We have to work together to make sure that Airbus, when they're building their plane, that they're not jammed up with higher costs because of tariffs on critical components that they need. And so in Congress, I will always fight for sensible trade policies that benefit the industries, especially those locally here in this district.
Mr. Figures, thank you. Ms. Dobson, you now have 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
If we're talking about what's hurting manufacturing, it's been the policies of the past 4 years that have caused skyrocketing inflation due to reckless government spending. That policies that my opponent helped put in place when he was part of the Biden transition team that crushed American energy. That's why I've been endorsed by Manufacture Alabama, because they know that I will get American energy back on track, that I'll bring down inflation by cutting reckless government spending and help the manufacturing industry in this district.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you now have 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
I agree with my opponent that reckless government spending can certainly not be good for business. And that's why it's heartache when we look at the fact that the Trump administration added $5 trillion to the national deficit. We have to be responsible, and our policies have to reflect that. We have to hold our government to the same standards that families across this country are held to in terms of living within your means. But we have to have policies that support growth and incentivize our builders to build and our developers to develop to enhance and increase the efficiency and productivity of our economy here locally.
Thank you, Mr. Figures.
All right, our second question is about rural hospitals and rural health care. We're seeing rural hospitals close. For example, in our area, the Thomasville Regional Medical Center recently closed its doors. In some cases, the hospitals say it's due to a lack of funding or staffing challenges. Health experts are warning we could see an escalating rural health care crisis. So the question is, how do we handle this? What is the solution to make sure all Alabamians have access to quality health care? And Mr. Figures, you are first up with this question. You have 1 minute.
Look, here in the state of Alabama, we live, for all intents and purposes, we have the lowest life expectancy in the United States of America. There are 2 states that are lower than us by mere decimal points. So we're at the bottom of the map in terms of health outcomes. And people in rural Alabama, they suffer the worst. You mentioned Thomasville, but we've had several others close just in the time my opponent and I have been in this race. So this is a serious issue that we have options to address right in the palm of our hand. We can expand Medicaid. And Congress can help do that by passing, again, the incentive for the state of Alabama to do what's right, expand Medicaid. It is not a permanent solution. We also need economic growth, but had Medicaid been expanded, I can guarantee you that that hospital in Thomasville would still be open. So would the one in Bullitt County and Union Springs. So we have to make sure that we're actually taking this issue seriously and not just pretending that we care about it, because we have options at our disposal to address this. And it's not just a healthcare issue. This affects our ability to be able to recruit companies and families to live in this district that will contribute to our economies going forward.
Mr. Figures, thank you. Ms. Dobson, you now have 1 minute.
As the daughter of rural health care providers, I understand how important the rural health care crisis is and how vital it is that we get rural health care back on track. Strong health care is built on a strong economy, and we've got to curb inflation. We've got to have less regulation. And we also have to ensure that we have good paying jobs that provide private insurance that keep these hospitals afloat. Medicaid expansion is an issue for our state legislature, and I trust and hope that they will consider that. But we also have to have a strong economy to feed our health care. But while we're on the topic of health care, we have to ensure that our health care is driven by facts and not agenda. In 2022, Shamari and his DOJ sued Alabama to overturn laws protecting our kids from dangerous sex change procedures. This suit was based on lies and misinformation, and it harms our kids. I will fight to protect our kids here in Alabama.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you have 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
I agree. It must be based on facts. And the fact is, here we have the worst health care outcomes in the United States of America. We have the worst infant mortality rates, among the worst maternal mortality rates. We have hospitals closing. I don't care who you are. If you want economic growth in your communities to bring in those higher paying jobs, not even Nick Saban can close the recruiting pitch that begins with, "We don't have a hospital." So this is a serious issue that we must take serious. This is not partisan. This is life we're talking about. This is the health of people in these rural towns that need us to stand up for it.
Mr. Figures, thank you. And Ms. Dobson, you now have 30 seconds for rebuttal.
You know, in our last debate, Shamari said that the issue of sex change procedures is not one that Alabamians care about. And it's clear that he doesn't care about what his DOJ did in suing to overturn Alabama's law. The DOJ and the Department of Health and Human Services knew that there was no information that these procedures were beneficial. And in fact, they caused lifelong harm and infertility, and still they proceeded with this suit to harm our kids, prioritizing far-left ideology.
Ms. Dobson, thank you.
All right, now to the economy. Mobile's aerospace and defense industries are essential to the region's economy. What policies would you promote to enhance competitiveness, and how would you work to secure more defense contracts and federal support for these vital industries? Ms. Dobson, you have 1 minute.
As the granddaughter of 2 World War II veterans, I recognize that this district is so incredibly important, not just to the security of our country, but to the strength of our military. And that's why we have to have a military that is focused on ensuring that our men and women are ready for combat, establishing clear and simple rules of engagement, and once again restoring faith and trust in our service members. That also means that we need to fight to ensure that our defense industry is strong. Look, the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, my opponent was part of that administration, that signaled weakness to the world and has invited aggression by those who seek to do us harm. The Chinese Navy is now bigger than ours, and I will fight to ensure that our defense industry here in the 2nd District and here in Mobile has the resources they need to help our service members catch up when it comes to equipment and technology that they so desperately need.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you now have 1 minute to answer the question.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. Mobile's aerospace and defense industries are essential to the region's economy. What policies would you promote to enhance competitiveness, and how would you work to secure more defense contracts and federal support for these vital industries?
Look, it starts with an acknowledgement of the importance of the defense industry here in Mobile and throughout this district. We have several military bases that are located either in this district or in close enough proximity to where they affect what's happening in this district. We have several defense contractors both here locally and across this district. And so you have to be dedicated. You have to be dedicated to advertising and being the biggest cheerleader for your district. You have to be committed to the idea of going out and seeking those opportunities and partnering with those companies to bring that here. You go out and you show them that we have a proven workforce that can handle the work. You go out there and you show them that we can lead in this space, that we have experience doing so. That's why one of the committees I want to serve on in Congress is the Armed Services Committee, because I recognize the vitality of the defense industry here locally. But it starts with prioritizing us locally. It starts with keeping the eye on the ball and focusing on those local issues and going after things like defense contracts that matter and not spend time talking about sex changes. We're talking about what matters here locally.
Thank you, Mr. Figures. Ms. Dobson, you have 30 seconds for rebuttal.
Yeah, I think it's really disingenuous, and we talk about sex changes when these procedures have been shown to cause lifelong harm. And not only that, young children are incapable of providing informed consent. And the Biden-Harris Figures administration, the DOJ that you were working for, that you were chief of staff of at the time, acknowledged that informed consent could not be provided, acknowledged that these procedures were incredibly harmful, and still proceeded with a suit.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you have 30 seconds now for rebuttal.
Look, I think this exchange is symbolic of the type of representation that we'll get in Washington. Do we want people in Washington that are up there arguing about sex changes, or up here trying to get more defense contracts here in Mobile and in Troy and in Montgomery? Do we want leadership that's going to focus on national fringe issues, or do we want leadership that's going to focus on improving life outcomes, health outcomes, educational outcomes, economic outcomes right here at home? And as we've gone across this district, that's what we found, is they want leadership that's going to go up there and work on the things that actually matter.
Mr. Figures, thank you.
All right, our next question is about the redistricting. With the recent redistricting providing new opportunities for representation in District 2, how do you plan to engage with and address the diverse needs of all residents in our community to ensure that everyone's voice is heard in Congress? Mr. Figures, this is you first with 1 minute to answer.
Look, it starts, with a commitment to not go to Washington to be a Democrat or to be a Republican. It starts with the idea of not going to Washington to be an ideologue. It starts with going to Washington to be a statesman or a stateswoman, someone that is going to Washington to put the interests of this state first, this district first, every single day. That is what it starts with, that commitment. You're not going to agree with everybody on every issue, whether they are in your party or not. You're going to have ideological differences, but you have to have an understanding that we have a common goal. We have a common love. Both my opponent and I have a common passion, a common love for this state, for this district, for its people, for what it's meant to us personally, for what it's meant to our families, for where we've come from and for where we are. And if that's the lens through which you view this job, then we will always be in a place where we can take perspectives of everybody in this district, whether black or white, rich or poor, educated in college, or just at high school level, to Washington to work for positive progress.
Mr. Figures, thank you. Ms. Dobson, you now have 1 minute.
And I think what's so significant about this district is that every voice will be heard. And it's so important to represent every corner of this district. And living in Alabama and raising my kids here, I work alongside the people in this district. And on November win or lose on November 6th, is headed back to Washington. It's so important that we have someone who's invested in this district, who's ensuring that we are fighting for more opportunities for our families, that we are fighting to ensure that what you pay at the grocery store goes down, that how much it costs to fill up your car is once again reasonable, and to ensure that your kids have a chance to succeed in this district. I've spent this entire campaign ensuring that I hear from every single person in this district, because I want to go to Washington to fight for you, to give Alabama a voice in Washington.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you have 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
Look, I have spent my career working across the aisle. I had the privilege of working for a U.S. Senator who was one of just a few who represented a state that had one Republican and one Democratic U.S. Senator. I have the experience in working across the aisle with people from different backgrounds, from different perspectives, all with a common goal of seeking out solutions to real problems in our district. Not the finger pointing, not the fear mongering, but just going to work, getting to work to fix issues. And that's what I'm going to spend time doing as a member of Congress. And I find it amazing that my opponent knows what my plans are after November 6th, but we'll see.
Mr. Figures, thank you. And Ms. Dobson, you now have 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
I think you have to look at our backgrounds. You know, my opponent his campaign has been funded millions of dollars by dark money super PACs, groups that he was supposed to be regulating when he was part of the Department of Justice, have funded his campaign. So if you look at where his allegiances lie, over 90% of the PAC money he's received has been from the greater D.C. area. When push comes to shove, is he going to think about the families in the 2nd Congressional District or about his lobbyist friends in D.C.?
Ms. Dobson, thank you.
Now to tax policy. One of the first items the new Congress will face next year is a major rewrite of our nation's tax code. Many of the individual, business, and estate tax reforms enacted in 2017 are set to expire at the end of 2025, and the next Congress will be in the driver's seat for tax reform and determining how to pay for it. So how do you plan to address the federal budget while restoring simplicity, stability, and pro-growth elements to the tax code? Ms. Dobson, you have 1 minute to answer.
Look, there's no question that we have a spending problem. We're $35 trillion in debt. The Biden-Harris Figures administration has added $8 trillion to that national debt, and we're headed towards a financial cliff. If we ever hope to get inflation under control, we have got to stop the reckless government spending. $80 billion to expand the IRS, $1.4 billion on non-citizens. Meanwhile, we have American citizens that are suffering in the wake of Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton. When it comes to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I am fully supportive of making those permanent to ensure that our small businesses have consistency and that they are able to expand and grow and thrive. We have never had more tax revenue. We don't have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem, and that's because we have too many on the far left, Washington, D.C. insiders like my opponent with his $1.5 million house funding Washington instead of balancing the budget.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you now have 1 minute.
I'm blown away by the fact that a $1.5 million house that we work very hard for, is impressive to someone who spent over $2 million of their own money running in this campaign. When it comes to tax policy, when it comes to what we would do with this particular issue, you have to assess it. You have to assess it not through a partisan lens, but through a practical lens. You have to look at the fact that there were provisions in that tax policy that benefited businesses, that businesses were able to take advantage of, especially during COVID, when obviously they did not know what was happening. I was on Capitol Hill when this was actually passed. But more broadly speaking, we have to make sure that our tax policy reflects a simple understanding that the majority of our tax burden cannot be placed on those who can least afford to pay it. Those who benefited the most from the Trump tax cuts were the wealthiest in this society. And so we just have to make sure that our police officers and our soldiers can take advantage of tax cuts as well.
Mr. Figures, thank you. Ms. Dobson, you now have 30 seconds for rebuttal.
I think it's really interesting that my opponent criticizes me for using my own money and funding a campaign when I was just a working mom a total political outsider, when he's been bought and paid for by dark money super PACs, by donors from California and Massachusetts. Again, you have to wonder about where his loyalty lies. But when it comes to tax policy, the policies that he would support, taxes on unrealized capital gains, the $5 trillion tax increase that Kamala Harris proposes, that's going to hurt all families in this district.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you now have 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
Look, it's ironic that this dark money that my opponent is talking to came from the same groups that she spent her time catering to here for the last several months and trying to get them to support her. But at the end of the day, we got to focus on local issues. And we got to sit down with the businesses here in Mobile and talk to them about how they feel about those tax cuts. Talk to them how they were able to use that money to expand their operations and grow and create more jobs here. And make our decisions based on that, but not forgetting that we have to stand up for the everyday man and woman in this country as well.
Mr. Figures, thank you.
And we have a follow-up tax policy question. With the ongoing discussions about changes to corporate tax rates, what is your stance on maintaining the current 21% corporate tax rate? And how would you ensure that tax policy continues to support the growth of both large and small businesses in Mobile? Mr. Figures, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, I think the back end of that question hit on it, is that we have to prioritize focusing on small businesses and their interests and not just worrying about the big businesses, the big corporations. This economy is driven by small businesses, and I mean real small businesses. I mean those with 5, 10, 15, 20 employees. Those are the ones that drive the economy. Those are the ones that make America go. Those are the ones who are putting in the work every single day to make the products we have in this district, to provide the services that we have in this district. And that is where my priority will be, is standing up for those small businesses and standing up for those workers. And our tax policy has to reflect that understanding. We cannot put our small businesses in a place where they are disadvantaged and they don't receive the same tax breaks that larger companies do. And that's what I will always stand up for in Washington, D.C., is making sure that everybody has a fair shake and is playing by the same rules.
Mr. Figures, thank you. Ms. Dobson, you now have 1 minute.
Well, I equally am concerned about small businesses, but the policies of this administration that Shamari was part of have been killing small businesses with over-regulation. You see it in agriculture, you see it in transportation, in construction, in healthcare. Regulations that are designed to consolidate and control and support big corporations instead of allowing small businesses to flourish. You know, an example is the new home building area. The average cost of a new home, 27% of that is directly related to compliance with federal regulations. You look at energy costs. Alabama Power implemented 3 separate hikes in 2022 that impacted countless families in this district, all due to the regulatory state of the Biden-Harris Figures administration.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you now have 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
I mean, I'm so thankful for the promotion to President of the United States that I've received here tonight from my opponent. But the reality is this. Regulations do play a role. And we have to stand up for regulations that make sense because they impact what our small businesses can do. And you have to be willing to take a stance, even if it's against your party. Just here in Alabama, the nursing home industry has been hit by regulations that I personally feel make absolutely zero sense in terms of some minimum staffing requirements that treats them a little bit differently than other healthcare industry companies. And so we have to be mindful of it and make sure that everybody is treated fairly.
Mr. Figures, thank you. Ms. Dobson, you now have 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
Again, the record does not reflect what my opponent just said when he was part of the Obama administration. The Obama administration put in overly cumbersome waters of the United States regulation that tried to regulate how you used your pond in your backyard. They also put in place the Community Right to Know Act, EPCRA, that would have required small farmers throughout this district to report the amount of ammonia that their livestock produced. My opponent is a veteran of administrations that prioritize regulations over citizens.
Ms. Dobson, thank you.
All right, let's take a quick break. Welcome back to our special Alabama District 2 congressional debate.
We are hearing from the 2 candidates vying for Alabama's newest congressional district, and we're going to continue now with the questions.
Now to infrastructure. The Port of Mobile plays a critical role in Alabama's economy, and further expansion, including projects like the deepening and widening of the ship channel that will make it the deepest container terminal along the Gulf of Mexico. How do you plan to support this continued growth, and what additional infrastructure improvements would you prioritize to ensure Mobile remains competitive as a shipping and logistics hub? Ms. Dobson, you have 1 minute to answer.
Yes, well, there's no question that Alabama families throughout this district benefit from the growth and vitality of the port, whether it's folks here that are directly involved in the port in Mobile, whether it's poultry producers over in East Alabama, or timber manufacturers up in Southwest Alabama. And I had the privilege of actually visiting with Rick Clark today, and he said that a strong port is, of course, built upon a strong economy. So we not only need to fight for infrastructure for the port to ensure that we can deepen the channel, but we also have to fight for the businesses in this community, in this district, in this state. And I will ensure that I fight for funding to extend the inland rail extension to Montgomery that will alleviate traffic along I-65 corridor. I'll also ensure that we have adequate port facilities for break bulk in addition to container, because if there is another labor strike, if there is another COVID situation, we also need to have break bulk capacity.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you now have 1 minute.
Look, I grew up here. The city is called the Port City for a reason. It's because of what the port means to not just here in Mobile, but what it means in Baldwin County, what it means to this region, and what it means to the Southeast. So we have to prioritize making sure we have a strong port operation here locally. It contributes significantly to our local economy, provides thousands of jobs, and benefits thousands more, either directly or indirectly. So we have to prioritize making sure that we can make our port as viable as possible, and making sure that we have the workforce to go in there as well. But in terms of infrastructure improvements to enhance it, we got a bridge that we need to build here in Mobile. And it is a significant need, and one that we have to prioritize, making sure that we secure the funding to get it off the ground, literally. And so we have to focus on that. But beyond that, we have to focus on modernizing the infrastructure of the port as a whole, bringing in the technology that's needed to make us one of the more attractive port operations here in the Southeast.
Mr. Figures, thank you. Ms. Dobson, you now have 30 seconds for rebuttal.
Again, the health of the port is also predicated on the health of the underlying businesses in this district and in this community. And so I will fight to actually bring down inflation. I will fight against reckless government spending that's continuing to drive up inflation caused by the policies of the administration that Shamari was part of. I'll also fight to ensure that we remain in Alabama a right-to-work state, that our manufacturers have the labor force that they need, and they have the workforce development that they need to provide the products that are shipped out of the port.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you now have 30 seconds.
I mean, speaking of the policies of the administration that I was a part of, those policies included the largest infrastructure investments in American history, which included the bridge funding that was just announced, which is the largest economic investment by the federal government in infrastructure in the history of the state of Alabama. And we have to continue to drive that. We have to follow up on that. We have to continue to go to bat. And I will remind my opponent and the state of Alabama, while every Republican was here celebrating that funding for the bridge announcement, every last one of them voted against it.
Mr. Figures, thank you.
And continuing with the Mobile River Bridge, with the Mobile River Bridge and Bayway project getting a boost in funding from the federal government, what will you do to ensure it gets fully funded and completed in a timely manner? Mr. Figures, you have 1 minute.
You roll up those sleeves and you go to work. You understand the priority and the importance of it. You understand that what this means to this community. If you travel down Government Street here, just outside here after 4 o'clock on any given day, you will see the traffic backlogs. That affects more than just commuter transportation. It affects our ability and our efficiency in being able to move products outside of the port and get it into the American economy. So we prioritize it by going to work. We seek and we try to get placed on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee so we can have a direct influence on the type of money that is flowing down here. We seek out and develop strong partnerships with Secretary Buttigieg and the Department of Transportation in any administration, whether it is a Trump administration or a Harris administration. You prioritize building and strengthening those relationships so that you can work across the aisle and prioritize bringing in funding here locally, because at the end of the day, At the end of the day, it's about what can you do here locally. It's about prioritizing the people and places in what is now District 2, which includes the city of Mobile.
Mr. Figures, thank you. Ms. Dobson, you now have 1 minute.
The Bridge and Bayway project is so vitally important to families on both sides of the bay, and I will fight for funding to ensure that there is no toll component to the bridge, to ensure that the hardworking families in Baldwin County and Mobile County and families traveling on I-10 are not subject to double taxation through a toll system. But you know, my opponent likes to cherry pick the infrastructure bill. The truth is that infrastructure bill, out of $1 trillion, only 10% of it was spent on actual infrastructure funding. We only have finite resources in this country, and so in order to have the funding that we need for the Bridge and Bayway project, for the port, for the relocation of the airport, all of which are so vitally important to the future of Mobile, we don't need to be spending $7 billion on electric vehicle charging stations, on $80 billion on an IRS expansion. We have got to spend smarter and more wisely, and in doing so, we can bring down inflation.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you have 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
President Biden's infrastructure bill got this bridge in a place where it has not been able to get for at least 2 decades. We have been trying here in Mobile for years and years. In fact, the first time I met the mayor of Mobile was during the Obama administration, when they were there with mayors from the coast lobbying for funding to get the bridge project started and going. So what we should be saying is thank you, President Biden, for making that historical investment in the city of Mobile.
Mr. Figures, thank you. Ms. Dobson, you have 30 seconds for rebuttal.
President Biden's infrastructure bill also included a lot of wasteful spending that has continued to drive up inflation and increase the cost of what it takes to feed your family. That's plain and simple. Again, $7 billion for electric vehicle charging stations. Over 3 years, only about a dozen of those have actually been constructed, and that benefits maybe 5 people in the 2nd Congressional District. Meanwhile, there are people in this county who don't have access to clean water, people in this district who don't have access to sewage. We have got to be better stewards of our natural resources.
Ms. Dobson, thank you.
We've been talking a lot about regulations. Now here's a question addressing that. Many Mobile industries, from shipping to manufacturing, face regulatory hurdles that can delay projects and increase costs. How would you work in Congress to streamline federal regulations for businesses, ensuring compliance is simpler and more efficient while still maintaining essential safety and environmental protections? Ms. Dobson, you have 1 minute to answer.
Look, it is so clear that this administration has created a 4th administrative state, and that's true across the board. You look at the spending that is taking place to sustain Washington bureaucrats like my opponent, and it's unwise, it's reckless, and it's being poor stewards of the resources that we have in this country. I will fight to ensure that our regulatory framework is dramatically increased. We had a huge victory in the Loper-Wright case with the Supreme Court in rejecting the Chevron analysis, but now it's up to Congress to ensure that our regulatory scheme work is common sense and protects citizens, but also doesn't stymie the growth of business. An example is this administration, the Biden-Harris Figures administration's project labor agreement requirements for federal projects over $35 million. That eliminates about 89% of small American construction companies from even bidding.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you now have 1 minute to answer.
The regulatory framework that we have, it must be informed, it must be well reasoned, and it must be narrowly tailored. If we don't need regulations, they should not be there. We have to have people in Washington that understand the real impact. We have to have people at the table when regulatory conversations are taking place. You have to have people at the table who actually have worked in those industries, people who will be touched the most by those regulations, people who can speak to the daily impact. As I was speaking earlier about the nursing home regulations, that is a perfect example. It's a perfect example of a regulatory environment that's not conducive or informed or understanding of the true challenges of the day-to-day industry that is our nursing home industry here in this state and across the country. And so listen, I am not a fan of just regulations for the sake of regulations. I am not a fan of that at all. What I am a fan of is making sure that we have an environment here in the United States and in this district that is friendly to businesses to be able to do the types of things that they can to contribute to our economy.
Mr. Figures, thank you. Ms. Dobson, you now have 30 seconds for rebuttal.
Well, I also know that my opponent is a fan of Kamala Harris. He endorsed her on national TV, and her plan is to continue over-regulation of the businesses in this country, of the energy industry, continue to crush American energy. My opponent was part of Biden's transition team that stopped drilling on federal lands, that shut down the Keystone Pipeline. And we look now, and energy costs have increased 40%. It costs more to make, build, move, and transport things, and that's hurting every American family in this district.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you now have 30 seconds for rebuttal.
Listen, the economy that we work in, that we live in, it has to always remain the top focus of whoever is going to Washington, D.C., and making sure that we're advocating for policies and positions that benefit the businesses here locally. District 2 first. That will always be my mantra. That will always be what guides me to work every single day, is doing what's best and in the interest of making this the most economically viable and attractive district that it can possibly be.
Mr. Figures, thank you.
It seems on a fairly regular basis we are reporting on shootings, even mass shootings. What do you propose to reduce the number of deaths and injuries related to gun violence? Mr. Figures, you are of the first response with 1 minute.
Yeah, we have to do something. That's where it starts, with doing something, not just screaming about the problem, not just complaining about the problem, but actually making the real life investments in solving the problem, investing in those programs that limit the likelihood of a child going down a pathway as they grow up of ending up on one side or the other of a bad decision. What we cannot do is sit here and just accept this as the norm and just wait for it to happen and then think we can solve it on the back end, by just sending everybody to prison. If you commit a violent crime, that is exactly where you should go. But we cannot wait for that to happen. We have to get on the front end of this issue. We have to have policies that make sense. We have to outlaw Glock switches here in the state of Alabama. We have to make sure that we are investing not just in the law enforcement resources to combat this, but in the programs, the social programs to help combat this. Because this is not an environment, this is not an issue that we can take lightly in this environment. We have to be aggressive in this response, and we have to make sure that we're doing what's best for all of the people in this district.
Mr. Figures, thank you. Ms. Dobson, you now have 1 minute.
Look, as a mother, my heart breaks every time I hear about another school shooting, another mass shooting. And I know, like my opponent, that we hug our kids extra hard every morning before we send them off to school or preschool. This all boils down to getting guns out of the hands of criminals, giving our law enforcement the resources that they need, not just to keep us safe, but to restore trust with the communities that they serve. Having adequate avenues for treating the mentally ill in our communities. Right now in the Mobile County Jail, about 20% of the inmates are on psychiatric medication. They don't belong in jail, and but that's the only avenue for treating them. But we also have to treat criminals like criminals. And my opponent touts his involvement in a clemency initiative program under the Obama administration that resulted in the release of 1,500 criminals. It was described as being poorly planned and executed, and some of those criminals have been re-arrested for drug and murder charges.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you have 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
You know who continued clemency? Donald Trump. And I dare my opponent to say that Donald Trump messed up in continuing a program to let people out of prison who, if they were convicted of the exact same crime today, they would not be able to receive the exact same sentence, which is what that program was about. But as it relates to gun violence, this is an issue that we have to be smart on. We have to keep guns out of the hands of people who should not have them. And we have to be smart here in Alabama. Making this a permitless carry state made no sense and exacerbates the issue. So we have to be serious about actually fixing the issue.
Mr. Figures, thank you. Ms. Dobson, you have 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
If my opponent is serious about protecting the young people in this state, then I'd like him to answer why he and his DOJ in 2022 sued the state of Alabama to overturn our laws that protected our kids from dangerous sex change procedures and treatments that could leave them harmed for life, could leave them infertile, sterile, when there was no evidence supporting this, and actually evidence that showed that these procedures are harmful. He prioritized far left agendas over our kids.
Ms. Dobson, thank you.
Now to committees. The committees a member of Congress serves on play a critical role in shaping policy. If elected, which congressional committees would you seek to join, and how would your membership on those committees help you address the key issues facing Mobile's business community, such as infrastructure, trade, and economic development? Ms. Dobson, you are first. You have 1 minute to answer.
Well, again, given the number of military assets in this district, over half of the entire state of Alabama's military assets, with Maxwell Air Force Base, the F-35, with the defense industry here in Mobile, in Troy, with supporting industries in Russell County that are so integral to Fort Moore, I think there's an obligation of whoever represents this district to serve on the Armed Services Committee and fight, again, to strengthen our military, to ensure that we can have peace, because we can only have peace when we can deter, and we can only deter when we're strong again. Our military, the combined branches of the military, failed to meet its recruiting requirements by 41,000 troops last year, and that's directly related to the weakness of our current leadership, and I will fight to ensure that on the House Armed Services Committee that our military is getting the equipment and technology that they need, and also that the 62,000 veterans in this district are receiving the services that they need as well.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you now have 1 minute.
You know, the Hall of Fame basketball player Allen Iverson once gave an interview where he consistently said, we're in here talking about practice. And every time we jump back to sex changes, that's what I feel like. That we're in here talking about sex changes, and we got hospitals closing in this district, and we're talking about sex changes. We live the lowest lives in America, and we keep talking about sex changes. We have the worst maternal mortality rates almost in the country, and we keep talking about sex changes, issues that are not affecting people here. But in terms of committees, as I mentioned earlier, transportation and infrastructure to drive the investments that we need here in this district. Armed services to make sure we're prioritizing the defense industry and protecting the military bases that we have here. Agriculture Committee. This district is primarily rural geographically. Mobile and Montgomery have urban centers, but the remaining 11 counties are primarily rural. So we have to make sure that we're standing up to protect our farmers, to make sure they have access to capital resources that they need to grow and thrive in this economy in an environment where our rural communities are too often being left behind.
Mr. Figures, thank you. Ms. Dobson, you now have 30 seconds for rebuttal.
I'm not talking about sex changes. I'm talking about procedures that mutilate and sterilize our children. And it's true, we shouldn't be talking about sex changes because Alabama has a law that protects our children from these dangerous procedures on which there is no scientific basis for any benefit. And yet my opponent and his DOJ sued Alabama to overturn these laws that protect our children. They prioritize their far-left DC insider ideology over the safety of our kids.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you now have 30 seconds for rebuttal.
I worked on a lot of things throughout my career. I've worked on protecting the border. I've worked on giving resources to stop fentanyl. I've worked on health care. I've worked on protecting, making communities safer. But one thing I can assure you is that I never worked on sex changes. And at the end of the day, with all of the important issues that we have facing this district, the fact that we are spending valuable time talking to voters consistently about sex changes, I think is symbolic of the type of representation that we would have in Washington, D.C.
Mr. Figures, thank you.
Immigration is a major talking point. Some Alabama lawmakers have proposed new laws to create harsher punishments and penalties for illegal immigrants caught committing crimes. What can be done to control people illegally crossing the border? Is this an issue that the state should handle or the federal government, or is this an issue that should be handled federally? What would you do on day one to address this? Mr. Figures, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, the federal government has to get its act together as it relates to our immigration policy. And by federal government, I mean regardless of who's in control, because our immigration policies have not been fixed across Democratic administrations and Republican administrations, across Republican-led Congresses and across Democratic-led Congresses. This is an issue that the failure to fix does not lie in the lap of any specific party, right? So we have to come together. and we have to bring common sense solutions to it. What we cannot afford to do is, again, to continue to sit here and scream about a problem without taking the steps to fix it, which we had a bipartisan solution before Congress just several months ago, drafted by one of the most conservative senators in the Senate, James Lankford. It was a bipartisan bill, a good deal that would have passed, and that President Biden said he would have signed. But Donald Trump stood up and threatened every member in the Senate, and they backed away from it because he'd rather run on a problem than actually work on a solution. And so we can't tolerate that in the type of leadership that we're sending to Washington.
Mr. Figures, thank you. Ms. Dobson, you now have 1 minute.
There's no question that Alabama families throughout this district have been negatively impacted, harmed by our border crisis. And it's very dishonest of my opponent to pretend that this is the fault of a bill not being passed. The truth is, when he was part of the Biden transition team, they made a conscious decision through executive order to open our border, to stop the stay in Mexico policy, to stop building the wall, to actually sell off the components of the wall. This is a problem that we don't need a bill to fix. It could be fixed today by executive action. But in the past 4 years, we have seen 8 to 10 million non-citizens come across our borders. That's put a tremendous strain on our resources. As we saw, again, with victims from hurricanes, there's no money because $1.4 billion has been spent on non-citizens. Add that to the fentanyl crisis that impacts this district. In Sims, 3 young people died of fentanyl overdose in the past few months.
Ms. Dobson, thank you. Mr. Figures, you have 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
You know, there were fewer border crossings on average each year during the entire 8 years of the Obama administration than there were during just the 4 years of the Trump administration. So obviously it takes more than an executive order. But we can't forget who we are as a people. Because when I think of immigration, I think of how this country got here. I think of a man named Gerald and a woman named Kathleen who immigrated here from a small country, who have 4 daughters, all with advanced degrees. One is an Ivy League educated gynecological oncologist. One has been an advisor to 2 presidents, and I have the privilege of calling her my wife. They immigrated here from Haiti. So we can't forget what makes us us here in America as it relates to our immigration policy.
Mr. Figures, thank you. Ms. Dobson, you have 30 seconds.
It's like a DC insider to try to distract from the issue at hand. Of course, I'm all for legal immigration, but the reality is this administration has made it harder for people to legally immigrate here, has made it harder for businesses to utilize migrant worker programs. Meanwhile, we have an open border that has increased crime throughout our communities. We have 662,000 individuals that have crossed our southern border with known criminal histories. Of those, 13,000 have prior murder histories. This has got to stop.
Ms. Dobson, thank you.
And that concludes the question phase of tonight's debate.
You will each now have 2 minutes for your closing statements. Ms. Dobson, we begin with you.
Well, in closing, I just want to thank you at Fox 10 for hosting this debate. Thank you, Cameron and Sarah, for moderating. Thank you to the Chamber for all that you do to promote growth and business here in Mobile and the surrounding communities. And thank you, Bradley, for your years of public service and leadership and for your example. And I also want to thank all of you watching. Thank you for taking the time to be an informed voter, for realizing that we here in Alabama's 2nd Congressional District have the chance to make an impact, not just in the future of this district, but in the future of our nation for years to come. The great poet Maya Angelou once said, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." My opponent has shown us time and time again who he is, and he's a DC insider with DC values. He formed a clemency initiative program that resulted in the release of criminals. As part of Biden's transition team, he opened our border and crushed American energy. And when he was at the DOJ, he helped sue Alabama to try to overturn laws that keep our kids safe. He is shaped by Washington. He's controlled by Washington, and he'll do what Washington wants. And win or lose, he's headed back to Washington because Washington's his home. He can't honestly tell you that he's going to solve the problems that Alabama families face because he was part of putting those policies in place that have caused the problems. The solutions that we need don't come from Washington. They come from Alabama grit and hard work and ingenuity that many of you have displayed as I've met you across the state, across the district, on the campaign trail. Let's send a message to Washington. Join with me in fighting to make life better for Alabama families, and vote Dobson on November 5th.
Ms. Dobson, thank you.
Mr. Figures, you now have 2 minutes for your closing statement.
Thank you. Again, want to thank the Chamber and Fox 10 and WSFA and for your stewardship in putting this together, and also want to thank the staff here that's behind the scenes, as you guys are the real stars here in making this happen. Also want to thank Ms. Dobson. I think this is our last debate, but you know, being a young parent myself of young kids, I know that the toughest part of this is the time you spend away from your spouse and the time you spend away from your children, and I know we share a common goal in seeing brighter days for this district and for this state. I have learned throughout my career how this thing we call federal government works. And there are a lot of pieces of it that I don't agree with, a lot. But we need someone who can navigate it. We need someone who can move through it when necessary, around it when necessary, and do the things that it takes to put Alabama first, to put this district first, to prioritize fixing the issues here locally. My opponent may call it a Washington insider, but I call it somebody that's experienced in learning how this thing we call the federal government works. And as I go around this district, that's what people want. They want somebody that can bring results, that can bring a level of care, a level of concern, a level of focus to too many communities that have not been the beneficiary of that level of attention from their federal representatives. They want someone who can work to get the healthcare systems back up and running in Bullitt County, in Monroe County. They want someone who can find solutions to expanding the electrical grid capacity in Tuskegee to allow them to be able to recruit more industry. They want someone who's going to go and find that money that we need to build a bridge here in Mobile, to finish building that airport here in Mobile, to finish dredging out that port, and not just spend time talking about things that are on the fringe like sex changes. They want somebody that's going to go to Washington and get it done. Thank you.
Mr. Figures, thank you.
And we want to thank both of our candidates for participating with us tonight, the Mobile Chamber for partnering with us. And we also want to thank our sponsors, All In Credit Union and Southern Cancer Center.
You can also watch this debate again on our website, fox10tv.com, and also all of our digital platforms. Have a good night.
The Alabama District 2 congressional debate has been sponsored by All In Credit Union and Southern Cancer Center.